So we're going to change the pace now. We're moving through this talent pipeline to talk about women in the most senior positions in our organisation. So we have our panel discussion now. So I'd like to invite our panel moderator and the panel to come and join us on the stage. So whilst they're all assembling, I'll tell you a little bit about a lady called Sian Cleaver, who will be our facilitator for this session. Sian is actually a member of the Wise Young Women's Board, which, for those of you who don't know about it, is our shadow board. So we use them as our sounding board for what we're doing now and in the future, and to keep us real, to keep us sane. So Sian is one of our very valued members of that. So the conversation about the number of women holding board positions in the UK is currently headline news, with the Hampton Alexander Review publishing only yesterday. Our panel will discuss ways to unlock access to those influential operational executive roles and board appointments for women. We hope to move the standard conversation away from just how do we get more women on boards to how do we actually develop and promote the most talented women from within our organisations so they're able to take up those most influential positions that are available to them. So with that, I'll hand you over to Sian, who will introduce the panel.
Thank you very much, Susie. So as Susie said, we are really fortunate to have with us today some really knowledgeable and really quite influential guests on this panel with us. So we've got a lot to discuss in this session. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce to you all of our panellists. Now, just to note, if you'd like to know a bit more about any of the panellists, have a look on the conference app, and there's a little section there with all the bios. So on the left here, we have Phillip Hampton, who's the chairman of pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline, and also the chair of the Hampton Alexander Review that was published only yesterday. So as Susie said in her introduction, this government-backed review aims to address how we can increase the representation of women in the executive level of the FTSE 350 companies. Next to Phillip, we've got here Michelle Dix, who's the Managing Director of Crossrail 2 at Transport for London. So Michelle's responsible for developing the Crossrail 2 project and for gaining the funding and the powers for it. She was the first person to job share at a senior level at Transport for London. And she has some really interesting anecdotes as to how she was perceived by others whilst sharing the job with her male counterpart. We're also joined by Mark Stewart here, who's a general manager and HR director at Airbus Operations. And he's also an HR director at the wider Airbus group. So Mark's really knowledgeable on the current situation within Airbus at the moment, and he's also got loads of practical ideas of how Airbus can be promoting in-house talent to help them to reach these more influential positions. Jane Basson, next to Mark, also joins us from Airbus Group. Now, Jane is the Chief of Staff to our CEO, Tom Enders. She was appointed to this position in July 2016, and before this, she was appointed Senior Vice President of Leadership Development and Culture Change for Airbus. She's also set up and ran Airbus Group's Leadership University. Next to Jane, we'll also be hearing from Myrtle Dawes, who is the Planning and Dispatch Director for UK Energy Supply and Services at the energy company Centrica. Myrtle has worked in many different areas of the energy sector and was also one of the first women to work offshore as an engineer in the UK North Sea. And finally, we've got Michael Rowley, who's the Managing Director of Brands for Hearst Publishing Group. So Hearst publish household favourite magazines such as Cosmopolitan, Red and Good Housekeeping. Now, Michael offers a really interesting perspective to our panel because he is a man working in a typically female-dominated industry, but on quite a fairly gender-diverse board, which is led by a female CEO. So he hopes to give us a perspective of what it's like to work in a more gender-diverse environment, but one where there are still, of course, lots of issues surrounding work-life balance. So let's get started with our panel discussion then. I think probably the question that we all really want to know the answer to, in light of yesterday's publication of this Hampton Alexander Review, is what, Phillip, do you recommend to get more women into executive positions at some of the UK's biggest companies?
And thanks, Sian. It's a gigantic question for whatever it is, 2 minutes to cover. I'd encourage you all to read the report that Helen Alexander and I did publish yesterday. This is a joint report, by the way, and some of you will have met Helen. She was the former president of the CBI, the first woman ever to occupy that post, a fantastic role model for women. But if there's a really simple summary, the most important thing, which I just heard from the previous panel, is actually target setting. Because this happens in business not just in terms of gender diversity, it happens in business in terms of pretty much everything, that what gets measured gets managed, what gets measured gets done. And so establishing clear targets, both for individuals, what is your clear target, and for the company itself. That is the single most important thing. And that requires leadership, requires your own management of your own lives, and it requires the right leadership in the company. The best example I've seen, GSK is pretty good at this, actually very good at this by most standards, but the best example in recent times has been BHP Billiton, probably a company that many won't have heard much about, but it's the world's biggest mining company, historically incredibly, not just male, but macho. And they announced 2 weeks ago they're going to be 50-50. Right across the workforce, from the boardroom to the people who drive the 350-ton trucks around their big mines. There's no reason why women can't do these jobs. Historically, they've very rarely done them. Once you've established a target, then you find the mechanisms by which it all gets into place. And that is always situational for individuals and indeed for the company. So there are lots and lots of other things, and lots of them are explained in the report we published yesterday. But if there is the one big thing, it's the target. I just make one final comment, actually, which is about GSK and Emma Walmsley, we've announced is going to be the next CEO of GSK. She'll probably be the most senior business woman, arguably, possibly in Europe, possibly in the world, in terms of the scale of the business that she's running. And when I first talked to her about her ambition, and I thought I was going to get the usual pap and evasion of the real issues, which is what a lot of people, I'd say maybe particularly women, go to. And she said, "Oh, that's very easy." She said, "I want to be the chief executive of a large international public company, and I want to be there by the time I'm 50. I'd like it to be this company, but if it's not, I'll find another." She was and it wasn't a threat, it was just a statement of ambition. Now, she wasn't born like that. You were born to be an astronaut, I think, Sharon, but she wasn't born like that, and she probably didn't graduate like that. But as she went through her professional career, she had various levels of ambition. That had become her ambition, and she was just working backwards. How do I get there? So that's a very, very big message about focus.
Thank you. So Jane, let's take this to Airbus now. So from your experiences and observations there, what do you think would make a difference in getting more women into executive positions?
I think I definitely agree with what Philip's just said, targets. I might push the boat out a little bit, and this is not an official Airbus group position, so Mark, you can bash me over the head afterwards. I don't really understand what the difference is between a strictly enforced target and a quota, except that perhaps speed of implementation. So for me, what would really make a difference, and I don't mean government intervention, I don't necessarily mean to have a law. I think it should be the business that decides what makes sense for the business, that recognises that border diversity and gender diversity as part of that makes sense for the business, and then goes for those targets and then sticks to that and puts in place all of the mechanisms that are needed to do it. But I'd just like to say as well that it's great that you're appointing a female CEO, because one of the things that I think really makes a difference is to start to see women at the top. There are just not enough of them there. And we've had a lot of discussions today, in the room, outside, over lunch, about what you see is what you believe. One of the things I've been struck by in this remarkable building is the tremendous lack of pictures of women, actually. And there is one on the ladies, but it's the only one I've found so far. So I want to see more women that show me that it's possible, that yes, I can believe it. And not everybody has that strength of focus to be able to say, I want to be there when I'm 50. But if other people are there, then you think, well, why not? So more of them
Exactly. And Mark, so what can we be doing, what can companies be doing to really promote any sort of in-house or homegrown talent to reach these more influential positions? I mean, what's being done at Airbus at the moment?
I mean, I think there's something either ironic or symbolic that we're holding this event today. Because I picked up the newspaper today and it said, I think it was Gender Day or something like that, which in essence says that the majority of the people in this room are going to work for nothing between now and the year end. And that for me is just unbelievable. So I think it's simple. If you do nothing, you'll achieve nothing. And I think companies really have to embrace the whole aspect of diversity. But if bringing it back to Airbus and the things that I think other companies can learn from, and picking up on points Jane and Sir Phillip mentioned, I think you do need to have set yourself goals, whether they're targets or whether they're quotas. What's important is that you actually live and breathe them. And it's not just about the number of talents that you hire externally. It's about what can you do internally to change the perceptions, some unconscious or conscious bias that may or not exist. And for me, it includes having targets on promotions, targets on identification of talent within the organisation, on, dare I say it, ensuring that for every vacancy that females are shortlisted for these vacancies and we don't just leave it to choice. Right through, and some of the things that we've been doing in terms of trying to push the pendulum the right way in terms of for promotions is that we've taken a conscious decision for our assessment centres that 70% of the opportunities will be for female. That was a conscious decision that we took to try and push that pendulum. In terms of our talent programmes at the senior level, so Achieve, Expand and others, we've set targets that a minimum 25% of those participating have to be from our female population, our female employees. Just some of the things that I think we can do.
Okay, and what about from the rest of the panel? Any good practices at other companies, at TfL, for example?
At TfL, what we've done, following the celebration of 100 years of women in transport, is try and get women interested in all aspects of what TfL does. So it's not specifically to become engineers. I happen to be the only engineer on our board, and I'm the only woman on our board. But the people who are running TfL come from all sorts of different backgrounds. And what we did through the 100 Years of Women in Transport programme is to let girls know the sorts of jobs you can have at TfL and then rise to the top and run it, that would range from occupational health to actually working on the track, fixing things, to some of the advertising, the creative side of the work, a whole range of professions. And that gets people excited about joining the organisation. You can get them into teams and then they can change roles. So there was a girl I used to work with who came in as a PA to one of the chief engineers. She showed a lot of interest in the technical side of the work that we were doing, wanted to go and do a course, particularly in terms of programme management, said yes, go and do that, came back. She then became the project leader for the traffic engineering implementation required for the congestion charging scheme. So it's getting them into the industry in the first place and exciting them about it. And once you get more females into the industry, regardless of roles, then I think you can change the culture of that industry and then hopefully promote people up.
And Philip, so what are your ideas on this? What things can the companies be doing to get this in-house talent up to the top so that they can reach these targets that you set out in your review?
Well, we have set out quite a few of them, but I just touch on them. First of all, you have to be really careful about simple processes. There's no single silver bullet, as it were, about any of this, but there are lots of steps. But everybody is an individual. The individuals are much more important than the stats and the processes, which is why you just don't, as it were, go through the mechanics of this. I personally think, I've been involved in mentoring women to get into senior roles for about 12 years now, and I think mentoring is hugely important. The single biggest, and this is old stuff and it may be a gender stereotype, but it's one of the ones that still I see very often, Women don't put themselves forward nearly as much as men. You may have heard this said before, but if a woman is 7 out of 10 for a role, she says, I'm not ready for that. If a man is 3 out of 10 for a role, she says, yeah, I'm going to go for that. And so, now that is still a gender stereotype that I see over and over again. Women are much more reluctant to put themselves, at least in my experience, forward for the big challenges, or don't get picked out for the big challenges. They don't get their elbows out to go for the big challenges early in careers. Those can be very important things to do. Networking, this is a networking event. Men are, in my view, not nearly such good natural networkers as women, in terms of how they run their lives and their society interactions and so on. But men network much more effectively in business for some reason than women. I mean, of course, a lot of that is just simply history. It's not fundamental. So there's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't change, and actually no reason why it shouldn't change very quickly. And then I think there's the other thing I'd say is, and this is for individuals and for companies, we do have unconscious bias about everything. One of the things that we still have unconscious bias about is what leadership looks like. And many of us, men and women, have this notion that leadership looks like a man. There's the famous business school case of Howard. Howard is doing all these sorts of things, and he's set out his CV, and everybody thinks Howard is terrific. And then you just change the name to Heidi, and Heidi's not somebody you want to employ. And men and women have that sort of same perception. So, I mean, I think all of this is part of a cultural change. But this conversation would not have taken place, in my view, 10 years ago, and it definitely would not have taken place 20 years ago. So I think we're just going through actually quite a significant revolution. And there's definitely never been a better time to be a woman in business. So, best of luck to all of you.
Okay, and just to pick up on that point, Michael, I'd be interested to hear from you here. So do you think that there's a bias in the perceived idea of what we're looking for in directors? So are board chairs subconsciously recruiting in their own image, and how can we ensure that that doesn't happen?
Well, I guess if you measure on outcome, yes, there's clearly an inherent institutional bias. And I think a lot of it comes down, before you kind of get to the board level, the practicalities of the modern workforce, where childcare is such an important issue and a potential difficulty for those that are taking that responsibility within the home environment. We've done a lot to try and drive practical initiatives around that. There's actually quite a lot of government help you can get around tax relief if you use the right sort of nurseries. It's remarkably well known, and I'd ensure that all HR directors find out from the Treasury what you can get on that. We've rolled out that programme amongst our workforce, and it's made a material difference in terms of the amount of money that they have to find for childcare. Then I think the big one is culture, which I think will then roll up to when you get into more senior positions. Our statistics are of the senior management team, the executive board, about 2/3 are female and 1/3 are male. Our organisation is about 70% female employees. Our CEO is a woman as well. So the culture, inevitably, it's not a surprise, it's not strange. If you do employ someone like you, it's more likely to be a man than a woman, but I'd hope we'd get to kind of gender neutrality in terms of people's perceptions. But the practical support around that, I think, has to be that it's as common for men and women to take maternity and paternity leave. We were very early adopter. One of our journalists on Esquire magazine, ironically enough, did a stint of paternity cover when it was first available to swap between maternity and paternity cover, and wrote a very interesting article in The Observer about that. What is interesting, I think, is the perception of colleagues, potentially male colleagues, to that is probably as important as the practicalities around it. And once it becomes more common, then that's great. So I think because we've reached critical mass, it's probably less of an issue for us, but it's always an ongoing issue in terms of wanting to create that support network and culture within the organisation. And then there's one other issue we particularly care about. Our breadth of our portfolio of brands covers everything now from younger women to older women to men as well. Inevitably, it's as much digital as it is print, and it's a lot of experiences. So we reach a wide breadth of population, both in terms of interests, but also social demographics. We've got to make sure we get people coming in from different economic backgrounds, and that is traditional perhaps in London and the South East, where if you want to do an internship, you're probably going to be from a family environment where you can have financial support to do that. Housing is a massive issue. So on brands like Cosmopolitan, we're doing a lot of work about trying to get accessible housing for younger women coming into the workplace. We do CSR initiatives ourselves where we reach out to people for internships that wouldn't normally be able to come into an organisation like ours, and we do that through third-party charities. We have a wider initiative called Hearst Empowering Women, which is an issue-based concept. There's also a financial profit-based concept, but there's also a big CSR element to that as well, which I think is important to us. And one of the things I'm particularly trying to drive as well, if we're reaching younger women to come into a workforce where economically they wouldn't normally be able to do that, is it worth also reaching out to some young men to do that? Because frankly, ours is an environment where young men, particularly from more less well-off backgrounds, would, I think, from a peer group pressure point of view, feel entirely comfortable about saying that. So we can reach out to those people as well. It'll make a difference, I think.
Of course. And Michelle, what do you think? So do you think that there's a bias in what's looked for in a director at the moment? So is TfL doing anything in particular to stop this from happening?
I would say as one of my anecdotes that I didn't think there was bias until I experienced it. And I experienced, I sort of like, I'd worked for sort of 21 years before sort of coming to TfL as a job share. And I job share with a friend of mine, a bloke called Malcolm. And we were both the director of congestion charging. And we worked together on a Wednesday. And on Wednesday, we aimed to see sort of like key stakeholders hold meetings. So we'd turn up at the meeting together, and someone would come up to me, give me their coat, and ask me to go and make a cup of tea. Sort of thing. So I would take their coat, and I'd go and make them a cup of tea, and I'd put them back down. I said, right, I'm chairing this meeting. And just the shock on people's faces. But that was the first time I'd experienced it. I thought, this must go on all the time. I think so, like, there's a recognition now that there is bias, and one needs to do unconscious bias training. But the more women you can get into a team, the less obvious that will be, because you're exposed to things. The other thing I wanted to say was, actually, we have had a lot of women's events at TfL in the years that are talking about the issues and how to change things. But a couple of years ago, on International Women's Day, the staff network group set up a meeting, but to go to that meeting, you had to bring a bloke. So the bloke had to come with you. Basically, so they could hear the issues, so they could be made aware of the issues. That had a profound effect, because we can talk amongst ourselves about the problems, but if the blokes don't appreciate the problems, then it's not necessarily going to change. I mean, you obviously do, because you're here, but sort of it's not going to change as quickly as it should do. And as a result of things like that, we've now got our commissioner, who is the champion. And because he's championing things, and we've got a new head of the Underground, Mark Wilde, who is also sort of like bought into this, they're telling the rest of the men they've got to follow their example. There's got to be a culture change, and that they've got to pick out blokes that aren't behaving, and women if they're not behaving well, but pick out people who aren't actually behaving well within the organisation to promote women across the organisation.
I fully agree with you. I mean, I think one of the things, Jane talks about role models at senior levels. I think you need to have role models right through the organisation, so that no matter where you are in the organisation, you can see people. So it's about celebrating success and raising awareness at the same time. And we've got Emma England, who's one of the participants here today. She was the SEMTA Engineering Graduate of the Year last year. She was seen as top 100 manufacturing 20 exemplary. We had Jackie Castle, who's our chief engineer on 350, one of the top 50 engineers. We've got to make the most of that in the organisation to help give people throughout the organisation a sense that people can get their careers on an upward trajectory as soon as possible. Yeah.
So I totally echo that. Engaging with men and many of these issues is very important. We've done a work around brands such as Esquire, where we've done an issue around feminism and from the perspective of a male. And one of the most popular articles that we did on esquire.co.uk was a piece by a feminist writer on how men can deal with some of the more tricky issues with their girlfriends and why girlfriends think and say the things they do. And I wouldn't underestimate, for perhaps people who've been brought up in a traditional way of thinking, it is quite a big leap, and I think education and support plays a big role in everybody understanding these issues better.
We did a lot of diversity training And it's very different, the environments that we all come from. You know, in a heavily male-dominated blue-collar environment, you can imagine diversity training is very different to a cosmopolitan engineering organisation. But I thought Myrtle shared with me something of her experiences on the Alpha 40 field.
40 Bravo, yeah.
Where you said you walked into a room
Yeah.
and was confronted by educational
Material.
material, shall we say, and had nowhere to go. But you turned that into a strength, where you made the people in the room feel really, really uncomfortable about what it meant for you. And you were able to change, in a way, the mindsets.
I think the other thing I'll say about that, so this is when I went offshore and I got lost and I went into a room and it was the ceiling, the walls, everything was pornography. And so I did ask for some help to find where I was going. There was a lot of awkwardness. One of the things I took from that is that the managers of the 40s field obviously wanted to transform. They had some targets as well. And they removed, they said, look, we don't want, when the female engineers go offshore, that they be exposed to this. And so they stopped. So what happened is OIM would stop all the films, the educational films and everything else when we went offshore. And that caused a lot of resentment because people said, oh, well, Myrtle's offshore now, so we can't watch our films. So actually then what happened is they did the right thing and they stopped everything and said, so it doesn't matter. So any engineer can go offshore. The remarkable thing was that you found out that actually some of the men were very uncomfortable with the situation as well. They didn't like going into rooms, and sometimes you forget there's a voice there of people who are quite supportive, probably don't always have that catalyst to say, I actually think that this is all wrong. And so we shouldn't always feel that we're on your own. And that's one of the things I really realised when I was working on my own, that you can feel very isolated, but you're not actually. There's a lot of support there.
Okay, that's really interesting, Myrtle. In fact, I've got another question for you, Myrtle. I'm really interested to hear more about the STEM side of things now. So obviously we're in a room here probably with lots of women from STEM industries. And I'd really like to know, Myrtle, do you think that scientists and engineers bring something different to a board of a company? So should we be encouraging us STEM women to look for non-executive director positions in all sectors, so not just the STEM sectors?
So absolutely. I mean, I've worked on quite a few leadership teams, and there is a really big difference depending on some of the backgrounds. So in particular those, I mean, I've worked a lot in energy, so with lots of geoscientists and engineers. Typically, everything that we're trying to do has a 10 or a 15-year lead time. So everything is a lot longer term. So things are happening on a daily or an annual basis, and we're saying, but we still need to move forward with long-term plans. And this is very, very different from some of the others. In particular, I wouldn't insult them, finance, which is, what we need to get that cost cut in next year, and would sacrifice a 10-year project to do that. And you really do need people who can look beyond just the goals that you've got this year, next year, and the year after that, to the long-term growth of companies, which typically, if you're working in engineering or science, you have to do, because it takes so long to get anything manufactured or made and into production. So for sure, and I think that long term is some of the things. If you look at some of the countries who are very successful at the moment, they have people who are thinking very, very long term in their companies in order to deliver things over a 10-year period. So absolutely.
And Michelle, what do you think? I mean, is there anything that STEM women add that others might not?
I think sort of it's good to have in a team people with different mindsets, people who problem solve in different ways. You can challenge each other in different ways. And I say, even if you say take our sort of exec team at TfL, we have different backgrounds. You know, the sort of head of the communications and marketing actually didn't have a degree at all. Worked his way up through the banking system and got into communications and marketing that way. Thinks differently to the way I think, as do many of the others. And you do have a stronger debate. I think it's also, I recognise that when I was working in this job share with my partner, we'd have a problem and we would look at it in a different way. and then have an argument about sort of like the pros and cons of the different way, and then we'd come out with a, you know, a better answer, better than either of us had. So I think just simply because it brings a different sort of like problem-solving mindset, then it's worth having sort of like a good mix of people on all teams.
And Jane, what about
It might
Airbus?
be a good route as well for STEM women to succeed in STEM organisations, making it, shall we say, all the way up to the board or senior leadership, because very often, and we see this at Airbus, where we're doing a lot with, you know, succession planning for our executive committee, making sure that we have women in the succession plan, etc. Very often what you hear is, she's great, but she's not ready yet. Or, yes, but not now. Or actually, you hear that from men as well. So. But you know, that there is that resistance there. Whereas if you had STEM women going and becoming non-executive board directors for another industry where it's more common to have women, they bring that diversity, their engineering or science skills to that, and then when they come back, they can say, well, yes, actually, I do have this experience, because that's the other thing is, so no, she doesn't have that experience yet. Well, obviously, if you don't give it to me, I'm never going to have it. So I think it's a good sort of, to get those loops through different industries as well.
Can I just say that experience business is an issue in terms of recruiting women, and we normally, when we're recruiting our graduates, sort of like look for experience, even though they're graduates, and obviously, you know, maybe if you're a bloke, you've got more chance of working on a site before you sort of applied for your university course, etc., etc. But if you ignore the experience and just concentrate on their strengths and capabilities, you get a completely different mix of graduates come through. And this year, for the first time, I mean, it's not 50%, we had 40% of the graduate intake were women. It was just a noticeable transformation, and it's applying that to other recruitments, not just your experience, but what are you capable of doing?
And Philip, going back to the makeup of boards, you said to me that you've observed a slightly different setup in Germany with more CEOs there tending to have technical backgrounds than in the UK. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long-term trend, a long-term feature, and, you know, heaven knows what the social origins or business origins of it are, but it's definitely visible. German companies, for a long time, have tended to, German engineering companies have tended to say, we want the CEO to be the best engineer, because we're an engineering company, in a rather simple, Teutonic way of looking at it, pretty hard to argue with. In the UK and the United States in particular, the CEOs have tended to come from a wider range of backgrounds. They may be financial, they may be marketing people, maybe commercial people. Sometimes, actually, particularly in America, they can be lawyers. And there is some analysis to say, actually, that, again, a lot of this comes down to leadership, that if your CEO is an engineer, the company is all about engineering, and they reinforce each other, which is why German companies, you know, have been really successful long-term about engineering. There may be failures as well in that, and just if I can just expand that a little bit, and just in terms of the gender contribution now. Again, I think this is at the moment now. So you may feel it's not enough. In fact, it isn't enough, but it is starting to look transformational, because we've just produced the data, which we published yesterday, on who's actually running big UK companies. And, you know, when I joined my first FTSE 100 company board 25 years or more ago, there were just no women at all, as close to zero as makes no difference in those sort of top positions. And we looked at, not the boards are now mainly non-executive, and that's a big change in the last 20 years, but the executive committees who really run companies, and the people who report directly to executive committee members. For the FTSE 100, that's about 6,500 people. At the moment, about 26% of them are women. Now, that is still lower than it should be, but actually it's quite a good building block. And as I say, I think that number would have been tiny 20 years ago, and now it's 26%. So there is a really, and those are the top jobs. You know, there's the highest paid, the most important, the big full-time jobs. And there is a really big effort taking place, both from women and actually from the leadership of those organisations, to get more women through. So it really is happening. Women are getting top executive jobs in the top companies, which is fantastic.
Okay, now Myrtle, I'd like to come back to you, if I may. So do you have any personal experiences that you can draw on to advise those who are currently underrepresented in these senior positions as to how they can break through?
Yeah, I think you have to be realistic about the environment in which you work, and I'll quote the company. So I did actually used to work for BHP, Billiton. And one of my managers did say to me, you know, look, Myrtle, you're really, really good, you know, but, you know, when we are looking for someone in a leadership position, it just doesn't look like you. And I actually thought he was very, very bold and honest to tell me that, because I might have thought that I needed to try harder. So that was very good. In reality, I then retorted that, you know, you obviously need some training. I'm not the only one here who obviously has got some development to do. But you can't actually say that. But I think. But that did land me in actually a very good place, because it did help me to anchor where was I? Was it that I wasn't trying hard enough? And I realised that obviously that wasn't the case. I still think it's important that people can respect you for what you're doing. But if I then reflected on what I did to move forward, it came back to, I think, how I felt about myself, in terms of I was still, well, if I'm going to get that next job, I've got to be really, really good. And that's what I focused on, getting to be able to do everything. And so I think my threshold of worthiness was obviously a different level, because I used to look at everyone else and I don't know why you got the job. And then I started to say, well, I don't really need to change, but I need to view myself and look at that gap and say, I think I'm ready. I'm not going to wait. And actually, once I started to do that I don't really need to know everything. I don't need to be confident in everything. It actually did make a breakthrough, because I actually did put myself forward. So this is a personal thing now for a lot. And recently I've moved actually out of capital projects now into a completely different role, doing planning. And, you know, this is something I wouldn't have done before, but it's absolutely essential for gaining the breadth to go to the more senior level, because you do need to know how to plan for the company and how to, you know, so that you can give that input. So I think for me, the most important thing is around being able to judge yourself relative to others, not be too harsh, because normally, if you're in that job, you're already quite good and actually capable, and you really need to be able to not to be too harsh on yourself, and be very confident and accept that some things will go wrong. So I actually do accept that things will go wrong and there'll be failure. I tell my team that I'm not always right. Things will be there'll be some failures, 1 in 10. Sometimes we count them and we say, okay, Myrtle, you've had your failure now. You've got to get the next 9 things right. So I think you just have to give yourself some space to be good, really.
Mm-hmm. And Mark, what about you? So as a man in a female-dominated industry, do you have any advice to those who are currently underrepresented at the top as how they can break through?
It's interesting. It was interesting, some of the comments, that the questions people get asked in their career. And I've certainly been asked in my career, how do I feel about being a man working in a women's environment? And I've been slightly jarred at that question and realised obviously we didn't get that
sorry,
question.
I called you Mark and not Michael. I'm
don't worry
very
about it. Having a familiar name.
You can answer as well, Mark. Please do.
And jarring at that and thinking, oh my goodness me, people obviously get asked that question quite a lot. And also occasionally being in a meeting when you realise you're the only man, and you know it doesn't bother me particularly, but you think, oh gosh, I'm the only man, and then realising that must be quite a common occurrence for different for women and indeed people from different ethnic backgrounds. So I guess all of that is, I would say, having watched it and having, you know, the things you can put in place, I think it's a comment you say, it's all about your own confidence and making sure there's support there. And also making sure that the metrics that you're measuring by are appropriate. You know, it's not always longest hours, it's not always how matey you are, it is sometimes the quality of your work, God forbid. It is sometimes, you know, the conscientiousness that's there. That doesn't necessarily need to be measured in number of connections or time spent in the office. So I think it probably comes down to confidence. I think the challenge is confidence and culture does take an awful long time to change. I think it's obviously easier in some organisations and types of industry where that's moved further forward, but you are beginning to see that now across the board. I'm starting to think about how we change that. I think I talked about earlier with what we do about CSR. It's not just the work environment, it's the pre-work environment and the societal changes we need to make as well.
Does anyone else have anything to add on that one? Any advice for
I'm
people
just
coming
really
up?
inspired by what Myrtle said. So I wasn't going to give any advice because I don't really think it's my place to give other people advice. But I would advise you find somebody like Myrtle and talk to her.
There is something very practical we do. We do a lot of mentoring, which is really good, and I'd mentor people, but we also make it very clear reverse mentoring is very important. So when I'm talking to people, particularly from the next generation in, often millennials, it's really important to hear their view of the world and realise how different it is to yours. That's very powerful, I think.
And it's interesting in terms of reverse mentoring because we tend to think of it as generational.
Yeah.
We've taken it to some of our senior execs, lining them up with females so they can actually lower in the organisation so they get the real grassroots view of life. I mean, I thought it was quite ironic again, and you can sit here and have a debate, I'm sure, for about another hour and a half at least on the American presidency. And what did that mean for what we're talking about today? And one of the things that really did resonate with me was Hillary Clinton's glass ceiling, and she wanted to break through the glass ceiling. And I think that was quite symbolic in relation to any female in an organisation not saying no, not taking no for an answer, and actually having the ambition to break through that ceiling. And it might be artificial, but there is probably a ceiling there. And how can you break through that ceiling? Yeah? And it's probably down to some simple advice, which is not taking no for an answer. And you talked about delivering on certain things. It's building that credibility. It's being able to demonstrate that you are better. And 99% of the cases, that is the case. Better than the people that you're competing for roles are that happen to be male. Yeah, that would be one of the things I would definitely say. And the only person that's likely to hold you back in that challenge is yourself. And it goes back to what Sir Phillip said in relation to 3 males who think, 3 out of 10, I'll give it a go. Yeah.
Stop saying that. The more we say it, the more it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, actually, but on the bits of advice we've just had there, I think it's a good place to stop for now. And but thank you very much to all my panellists for that really lively and interesting discussion. I'd now like to welcome Nina here, who's going to provide a few comments to the discussion.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Nina Skrutska, and I have the privilege in 30 seconds to summarise all that wonderful, rich tapestry of discussions from our experts here. If I'm going to pick out maybe 5 or 6 thoughts, it is about understanding for leading companies, if they want to make a difference, to set targets. And we could go on to that debate about quota versus targets. The other element I picked up was women having ambition. Please have ambition. There's nothing wrong in having ambition in order to aim for a role and to go for it and not take no for an answer. And if that company doesn't give that opportunity to you or that department, move on. The fact that you can show that it's possible for women to lead and to see those companies, the ones who are stepping up and setting those targets. Obviously, they're target companies for you to go and work for because they're already saying, come on, talented women, we welcome you. We heard some great nuggets about networking, also about what does leadership look like, that debate. Does it look like Myrtle? Does it look like me? Or does it look like anybody else? it looks like a good leader, and we can paint that picture. And to summarise, really, because I can't pitch in for everybody all the wonderful things that they quoted, but from a wise perspective, all of those hints of what you've heard about what good companies are doing and what women should do are all encapsulated in our 10 steps. That's not a pitch, that's just a truism. If an organisation is living up to all of those different 10 steps that we've said, they will attract, retain, and promote women into those leadership positions. And if that organisation is doing it, then quite rightly, the only person who's stopping you from achieving it is yourself. And I've got Gillian now, who's got a few questions, even though we're running out of time, to ask of our panel. So please sit there, and thank you on behalf of myself.
So you've had some great questions and we can't ask them all. I have chosen 2 because they keep coming up. So the first one to the panel is, how do you stop tokenism when you are setting targets for women in STEM?
I think the key thing is actually, basically, I wouldn't agree with the quota, but I'd certainly agree with the target. And in the first instance, make sure you've got a shortlist that's representative. If your shortlist isn't representative to start off with, you're never going to get sort of like representation in terms of your selection. So having a quota for your shortlist, making sure you've got 50-50 on your shortlist, you're more likely to then be able to select sort of like a woman. And that's sort of not tokenism then. They've got that job on merit, but at least you've given them a chance.
And they've been on the shortlist. And the second question was, what can the magazines and indeed editorial do to support women in STEM?
Yeah, I mean, we do, because we cover such a wide breadth of issues, everything from good housekeeping, which is obviously very lifestyle oriented, Cosmopolitan, which deals with issues for contemporary women as they start out in their life. But we also do fashion and entertainment, and there's always a little bit of a debate we have, which is how much we lead and how much we reflect. We don't always, we sometimes get some criticism that perhaps reflect some of the mores, particularly within the fashion industry, but we do on the whole take a fairly ethical line to that. But also I'd put it on a purely business proposition. It makes total sense for us to engage with the issues that matter to our readers, and therefore it makes perfect sense to cover them in an in-depth, innovative and interesting way. So that's what we try to do.
Thank you.
I would just say, I think the media have got a much bigger role to play in actually addressing the imbalance in society that exists. And I'm sorry, I heard what you said, but if you look at TV and you look at what's on the programmes on TV, and my daughter, God bless her, is a sucker for all the rubbish that's on TV, it reinforces all the things that we're trying to challenge companies to do, and it starts with what people watch in their homes, I would say. Even, if you look at Coronation Street, who's the engineer, who's the mechanic? It's Kev, good old Kev. Who's in the calf? Yeah?
You'll be pleased to know traditional television viewing is declining quite rapidly.
I'm pleased to hear that.
Of magazine brands and digital.
And we do have a female technologist on the Archers now. Thank you for that. So shall we let you have a quick say, because targets has come up here quite a few times. So if you'd like to have a vote, then the next question that you could vote on is, do you think that targets should be mandatory in the UK? And this is around an article from the Financial Times last week that said women still struggle to join boards where targets are absent. So do we think that targets are a good idea for boards?
And executive committees, because boards don't really do very much.
Absolutely right.
Oh, this is a really interesting system. It must be so reactive. How brilliant. Thank you for that. Thank you. So we do, in general, think targets would be a good idea. And the second one is, TfL, Transport for London, have made some new appointments to their board at the end of the summer, and they've now got 50-50. How does that affect your views of TfL? How do you feel about them now?
It will get worse.
Sounding very supportive.
There's been a delay.
Well, there's a couple of people we need to talk to. And, but you know, they do say when they made the target and or indeed a quota in Norway about 40% women on boards, they said that afterwards the governance and the risk management got a lot better. So it could be that we should be more confident that they'll deliver a more safe and reliable service. So thank you for your votes, and thank you hugely to the panel for being here.
Well done, John.
Exit,